Good afternoon, and welcome to the penultimate session of the Cortina Digital Forum, where we'll discuss the very interesting topic of AI. It's hard to follow with a panel session after the wonderful interview with Mr. Quintarelli. I think he set the scene very beautifully for our discussion today. And to continue with the science fiction-based parallels that he started to draw, it's very easy when we talk about artificial intelligence to think about Skynet. Mr. Quintarelli showed that there's many examples that science fiction gave us through the years about artificial intelligence systems, but I think Skynet and the Terminator are the ones that are universally known in popular culture. And I think an example like Skynet is effectively what policymakers worldwide, especially in Europe, have always had in the back of their minds whenever they started to tackle technology regulation. The goal of regulating technology happens to be most of the time that of preventing that machines can take over humans and humanity. And so this certainly applies to what the European institutions do when they start writing laws. This was certainly the background for the discussions between 2012 and 2016 when the General Data Protection Regulation was being negotiated. And that, as you probably know, became arguably the most famous law that is universally known worldwide. And this is very much true for the discussion that we're having about artificial intelligence today in Brussels. There are many topics that we have discussed on this forum that are relevant to the future of our digital society, digital economy. It's probably difficult to find one that will stir more emotions than artificial intelligence. And there are many good reasons for that. Clearly, artificial intelligence represents the industrial engine upon which the raw material that is data will be able to create incredible results for the great challenges that we have. It's very easy to see the applications in healthcare and medicine. They're very important, clearly, in a time of pandemic. Or the importance that artificial intelligence will, the important role that it will play in solving the huge sustainability challenges that we have ahead of us. But clearly, since I mentioned Skynet, with great potential comes great responsibility and risk. And that is why the European Commission put forward a proposal for a regulation on artificial intelligence. And this is among the topics that we'll discuss. And clearly, in line with the rest of the Cortina event, we have a wonderful panel of experts from a policy and business perspective that have been working for years on artificial intelligence and its many facets, and we'll be discussing with them. I will not go through the full list that you can find on the website, but I will introduce them as I start asking them questions. The first one, and we're very happy to have her, is Lucilla Scioli, who's Director for Artificial Intelligence and Digital Industry at DG Connect at the European Commission. She is the director responsible for the legislative proposal that the Commission put forward just 2 days ago, last Wednesday. And so it's only appropriate to ask her, since I also believe this is the first event where she's been invited to speak after the proposal was out, to ask her to illustrate what the proposal is about, what objectives the Commission plans to achieve with this proposal, and how it plans to do it. Lucilla?
Thank you, and thank you very much for inviting me to this beautiful event. Let me say, first of all, that we did not tackle artificial intelligence as a super intelligence that is going to wipe out the world. We are not thinking that that's what artificial intelligence can do. We were much more moderate in our thinking and rather referring to the risks that AI may bring about in terms of violation of fundamental rights or challenges to the safety standards we have established and we have achieved in the European Union. We think fundamentally artificial intelligence is good and it's very positive and it's very important in our economies and societies, and you certainly gave a good example with the impact it has had in healthcare, reading, for example, the images of the lungs of the patients affected by COVID and facilitating diagnosis and prognosis through that. So there are many, many different examples you can bring, and AI is going to be a force for economic growth and also for a better life. But it can bring up some risks, and these risks relate mostly to violation of fundamental rights or in terms of safety. And this is why we came forward with our proposal. And what our proposal essentially says is that we identify a list of use cases that we consider high risk. This is a limited set of use cases because most of the artificial intelligence market is not affected at all by our rules. This is a limited list of use cases that you will find in Annex 3 of this regulation. What we say is that we would like that those applications are actually checked before they're put on the European market. And they are checked from the point of view of the use of high quality data sets, for the point of view of providing the right information to the user, including indication on the human oversight that should be provided to those systems, information also about the accuracy and the performance levels. So essentially, we apply what we already have in our product safety legislation nowadays to artificial intelligence. We intend this way to minimize the risk that comes from artificial intelligence, and then allow it on the then there will be a surveillance authority who can actually intervene and go back and, through documentation that we have asked to put in place, also analyze the traceability and define where the harm comes from. So in a nutshell, this is our proposal. And then we will also go on prohibiting certain practices. In particular, we would like to prohibit the use of subliminal behavior to influence vulnerable groups and creating psychological and physical harm, as well as we would like to prohibit the use of AI for social scoring. We have a special chapter on biometrics identification. This is probably what is attracting most attention in the discussions that are taking place with biometric identification, unless there is a national law and a judicial authorization for the use of this technology in the presence of serious crimes that are listed in the legislation. We eventually then also set up a governance system which will continue to allow us to monitor the market, because of course this is a technology that changes over time, innovative, and needs to be monitored, and so that we can see whether we need to bring new use cases to the screening of before they're being put on the market.
Thank you, Lucilla, for that comprehensive overview. I'd like to move on now to Antonio Bosio, who's out of the Product and Solutions Division for Samsung. Antonio, great to have you here. I mean, artificial intelligence is probably my introduction talking about Skynet contributed to that, and Lucilla rightly reprimanded me for that. But, you know, it's usually associated with a lot of danger and futuristic scenarios of danger. And we tend to forget that artificial intelligence is here nowadays, and largely it's usually, you know, beneficial to a great extent. Can you describe to us what artificial intelligence today means for Samsung?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, first, allow me to say, I guess you are in contact with Samsung and know Samsung because in your life, some of our digital devices are possibly available. But Samsung Electronics is a lot more than physical products, physical devices. We have technology development streams for technology innovation, which obviously cover artificial intelligence, but also 5G, robotics, self-driving cars, sensors on machines, etc., on cars, sorry. And these streams I was referring to are obviously all interconnected one with the other. So we use artificial intelligence on the cloud and on devices. So having the best possible 5G connectivity allows all this to work better. And the same is true for a robot. A robot needs to receive information, and once again, connectivity and interconnectivity becomes very important and relevant. Well, simply to talk about the technical development at Samsung, I want to share with you, it's an honor for me to share with you that we invest $40 million a day in research and development, not just on artificial intelligence, but in general in themes connected to innovation. And where do we develop artificial intelligence? Well, Samsung is a global company. We have different research and development centers in various geographic areas, in various places in the world. And more specifically, those represented on the slide are the 7 research and development centers we have in the world that operate on artificial intelligence. Why such a global distribution? Well, first, obviously, there is an industrial issue, the possibility of working 24 hours a day on AI. But then there is also a deeper reason for this. The reasonable certainty we can minimize, if not totally reduce or eliminate biases, something that has been raised by Mr. Quintarelli earlier on. Artificial intelligence might have biases going with it. And so there are geographic biases, cultural biases that need to be taken into account. Having a research and development activity in artificial intelligence, which is so distributed in our planet, allows us to reduce or minimize this dimension of biases. What are the main pillars we're working on for artificial intelligence? Well, obviously, in general, the awareness is that artificial intelligence can help people access to what's positive about services and digital devices. The interfaces evolved a lot if we compare this to the past. An important leap forwards have been made, but still today there are parts of the populations that have difficulties in interfacing with the touch interface, and so can't really use all the value the digital world can offer them. So we are convinced that one of the most natural ways of allowing people to interact with technology is language, voice. So artificial intelligence in this framework is used to understand requests being made by the user of a device in the best possible manner, try answers to his or her questions, and give back answers to these questions as vocal messages. Then there's the stream that sees artificial intelligence used on devices. So we ask hardware to do a set of things that improve the customer experience, that improve the quality of life of people. And then in general, obviously, the possibility of making different devices interact one with the other, devices that surround us already today and that will surround us more and more in the future and will obviously encompass satisfaction in life. So direct and correct interaction amongst all digital devices around us allow also in this case to consider improving the quality of our lives and maybe free up space so that we can dedicate a bit more of our leisure time to what we like. And then, in my opinion, it is also important to share the fact that, given that we are aware about the complexity of this issue of artificial intelligence, we decided to follow a code of conduct. And the 3 principles that follow all developments are equity, commitment, so as to allow equity and diversity are the basis of our implementations, and avoid the propagation of biases, as we said before, because we want to guarantee everybody, also the most fragiles, to have access to services. And transparency, because artificial intelligence is often associated with a gray area. You don't really know what happens inside these machines, these models. And so, on the other hand, instead, we ask artificial intelligence to inform users when they interact with artificial intelligence, and we have the duty of showing to whoever wants to see it what's the code that allows these machines to work, so that it can be clear to everybody and everybody can understand which are the principles upon which decisions are taken and certain options are offered instead of others. And then responsibility. We are aware of the fact that a company such as Samsung has also a social responsibility, and this awareness is what is driving us. So we are committed to developing technologies to guarantee that in time such technologies will be protected and can evolve our skills and possibilities in the best possible manner. So artificial intelligence should not be an excluding element, but rather an inclusive element for all of us. I'd like to show you another couple of slides which show real examples of how artificial intelligence is now being made available in Samsung's devices we use on a daily basis. For instance, in the smartphone, the camera today is not just one single camera, but it's a set of different modules that interact one with the other in a very complex manner. And from this point of view, artificial intelligence allows the optimal set of regulations that allow you to obtain the best possible image when you take a photograph, or the best possible video can take place automatically without the user having to do anything, without the user having needing to have any skill in photography. We've recently applied artificial intelligence to a washing machine, and artificial intelligence applied to the washing machine allows us to understand what's the way in which all in all people wash in that household, and so we can simplify the representation of menus on the display. So we simplify the interaction with the device itself. An artificial intelligence machine, a washing machine, also deals with external issues. If I, during, say, a working day, start washing with the washing machine at 8 o'clock in the morning, and usually during a working day I leave home to go to work, the washing machine asks me if I really want to start the cycle at that time, or whether instead it'd be better to start later in the afternoon, so that when I come back in the evening, I will reasonably have the cycle will have been concluded, and I can use the stuff out of the washing machine. With TVs, you know that TVs now have high-resolution displays. Technically, we talk about 8,000 pixels per line, so 32 million pixels on one single display. The scarce resource is bandwidth. So today, the difficulty is that of allowing content at very high definition to reach these TV sets. So on TVs now, there is an artificial intelligence engine that does what technically is called upscaling of content. It comes through the internet, through the antenna we have on top of our house, a standard resolution content, and this content is evolved through artificial intelligence so that the usage experience of the person who's watching TV at that moment is the best possible, is the optimal one. And then another example in terms of helping people and improving the quality of life of people. We talked about language and voice. Think about those ranges of the population who are the elderly, but not just the elderly, also the disabled, who have difficulties in using digital devices. If they can't use these devices today, then they are automatically excluded from a series of opportunities others instead who can use these devices can use and exploit. So being able to simply speak to a device with a natural language and triggering those processes I have described before to then receive answers is, in my opinion, extremely important to move in the direction of not leaving anybody behind. Robots, you see them at the center of the slide now. These are robots that move and can help and care for the fragile and for the weak, so that they can carry out tasks they could not carry out otherwise. And then artificial intelligence can also be applied in clinical settings. In our product lines, we also have medical devices, basically X-ray machines or ultrasound machines. Physicians usually can correctly interpret these images in 85% of cases, but the algorithm of the artificial intelligence has the same capacity of identifying diseases, again, almost equal to 85%. But if you put together the artificial intelligence algorithm that suggests the physicians and the further analysis capability of the physician himself or herself, we go from 85 to 92-95% of capacity. So with this, I just wanted to talk about very practical things, which in my opinion allow us to understand to which extent artificial intelligence already exists and can already contribute to improving our quality of life.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Antonio. I think this was a very useful overview of current applications of AI. And also, I think you provided a level of overview of what companies are doing to respond to some of the ongoing issues with the implementation itself as part of their responsibility in deploying it ethically, we would say. And this is a great segue for our next speaker, particularly when you were speaking about AI in language. Our next speaker is Laetitia Cayetot, who's the European lead for data and AI at Accenture, and she's also the global lead for what's known as conversational AI. She has been, out there in the field studying and deploying these solutions. She also holds a number of patents in the field, and she's been working in sectors such as healthcare, financial services, among others. Can you explain to us, maybe expand a bit on what Antonio said about conversational AI? And if I can already follow up with another question, do you think that AI that can literally speak to you should be scarier or more reassuring to us?
Thank you, Alberto. I just wanted to thank you for including me in this panel. It's great to be amongst you all. I would also like to take this opportunity to congratulate Lucila for going live with the European Commission package on Wednesday. I think this is a great first legislative framework and really like a landmark proposal that looking forward to see and follow on the progress in the next coming months. So you asked me, I think Antonio kind of covered what is conversational AI. I like to explain it as a new paradigm shift in between how human and machine interact. If you think about it, historically, you typically needed, computers, training potentially to interact with systems, depending on the complexity of them. And conversational AI is really kind of reinventing this paradigm where you actually can interact with system in much more human-like ways. And there's a number of benefit to it. The first one is obviously the learning curve, because if the interaction pattern is like speaking to your colleagues or your family or society, it's actually much easier to actually get on with it. So from that perspective, it definitely have a huge accessibility angle. And one of the things that we have noticed is during the digital transformation we've created, over the past 2 years, 20 years, society created a bit of a divide in between the people that are digital can operate systems or digital services and people that are not. And I'm a true believer that, conversational AI can be used in ways that are actually helping bridge this digital divide. So very much aligned with Antonio's perspective. That you asked me, should it be scary or shall it be more reassuring? Well, I think it's like everything. One size doesn't fit all. Working on the ground with our client, we have noticed that, we as human sometimes prefer interact with non-human. Example of, finance, a number of people are actually surprisingly more comfortable interacting with, conversational AI system in those kind of scenarios, because they feel like, they wouldn't necessarily have the judgment. They feel that information is very private. So, for some, it's definitely reassuring. For other, we're definitely welcoming, this first pack. It is scary because a lot of people still don't understand, the impact, regarding their privacy. And that's something that this first package is going to help, create, a more transparent and trustworthy environment where people know that they can embrace the usage of AI without having to make any trade-off on their privacy or their human right or feel manipulated. So that's a very important angle. I just wanted to kind of give you and bring to life, one example on how we use conversational AI to really transform the way the world works and live. Obviously, aging is a huge challenge, in Europe, but also more broadly across the globe. Our population is getting older. That's a fact. And as we're going into this next phase of society where, there'll be more people that are older than younger, and an infrastructure around health and care, which is quite bounded to, human care and infrastructure that are quite costly and expensive. AI can really help transform that. So we created, and you mentioned in the introduction, a patent. We have a patent on a service called Home Care. Home Care is really using voice AI and conversational AI access of the older to co-create it with UK and we did see the impact it can have on creating, if you want, other options for people. Instead of going into care home, they can stay longer in their home, in the comfort of their community, accessing digital services and being supported. And using AI, not only voice AI, but AI into understanding what they like and what they need and their habits is very important, especially around the older population. There's not one size fits all, and personalization really is super, super important. We're all growing all slightly differently. There's millions of variation on, culture, mindset, how you're doing with your mind, how you're physically actually growing older and how you feel. So using AI to help streamline those experiences and make it nicer is absolutely essential. We had a couple of people coming back from hospital using the home care service, and they said this saved absolutely their life because they didn't have to move and they could stay connected and they could stay informed and having book read to them and things like that. So there's a wonderful set of things that can happen to kind of be very inclusive and not scary. But obviously, I think the framework that's been put out there is going to help, create that trust-worthy environment or trusting environment for people using it.
Thank you, Leticia. I think you touched on a number of points that we'll go through again in the rest of the panel. I'm looking at Lubna in particular. But first I want to go to Roger Taylor, who is the chair of the UK Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, a prominent expert on AI. And with you, I want to go more toward institutional/policy related questions, and particularly, given your role as a think tank, governmental think tank, and given your nationality, clearly I can't start. I cannot not start from the, reminding everyone that the EU and the UK parted ways. We all know that. And probably artificial intelligence, when it comes to policymaking, is probably the first example that we're going to have of the difference in approach in how the EU and the UK look at risk and opportunities, and how they look at the possibility or the necessity, the need to regulate. And clearly we all know that Europe is much more inclined to regulate than our neighbors across the channel. How do you explain that?
I should start by just emphasizing that I do speak for, as you said, for an independent advisory body to government. So I'm not describing UK government policy to you. But I will say a little bit about the advice that we have been giving to the government. We've recently published a report on algorithmic bias that looks at many of these issues. and what I think some of the differences in approach are developing in the UK. And I think the first thing to say is about the regulatory approach. I think we're all agreed there's an issue here, and that regulation needs to step up and deal with some novel technologies that create novel threats. The issue we have with the idea of a single new regulator for AI is that AI isn't the thing that needs to be regulated. We need to regulate recruitment processes to make sure they're fair. We need regulators to make sure that our roads are fair. We need regulators to make sure roads are safe, I should say. Our roads are safe. We need regulators to make sure that credit markets operate efficiently and are fair. But in each of these cases, we are finding that organizations in all these areas are adopting AI very rapidly. But they're adopting it in different ways, different applications, different levels of adoption. And the important thing is that the person who's responsible for making sure these are working is responsible for the whole that industry. What matters is not whether the AI inside a credit decision is working. It doesn't matter whether the AI inside a police force's decision making is working. What matters is whether those decisions are fair and consistent with our regulations. So we believe that the right level of regulation is in the decision making process or the product that is using AI. And that there are existing regulators in those areas, and that they are going to have to develop the capacities to deal with this. And one reason for taking that approach is partly, as I say, because the thing you regulate is not the AI. There's no point in regulating the AI separately from how it's part of a bigger process. But also because the context is everything in deciding whether a particular process is working or not, and whether the AI is making that process better or making it worse. The use of AI, deciding whether an AI is a good idea in an automated vehicle, or whether it is a good idea in a police decision-making system, or in an automated trading system on financial markets. The context is all important. If you ask a question, well, is the data good enough? Is it a sufficient quality? It's really impossible to answer that question without understanding the context and how that data is going to be used and how it is going to affect very specific decisions or actions in that context. And that level of deep expertise that it is required to regulate effectively exists within the regulators, who are very familiar with and have a huge domain knowledge about the relevant context. I think it will be enormously difficult to have an organization that can make sensible decisions about these issues that has a horizontal remit across all uses of AI. So those are the sort of the reasons we are thinking about regulation in a rather different way. There is, I think, also one other aspect to this, which is worth something that obviously the UK has become very exercised about with all sorts of consequences recently, which is sovereignty. And the issue here is that sometimes I think we see the question about regulation presented as a choice between safety versus innovation, economic growth, money, basically. So is it an issue between safety and money? But I think there is another way of thinking about this problem that it influences UK thinking. And this is the fact that sovereignty is likely to become an issue, in that it is highly likely that these technologies will become hugely important in almost every area of life, in the way that healthcare operates, in the way that financial systems operate, in the way that people manage their working lives. And that these technologies are developing very rapidly. And there is a risk, the risk that if we get the regulation wrong, if we create an overly burdensome system of regulation and that is the fear, that with a horizontal regulator trying to look across the whole market, every use of AI, that it could become overly burdensome. the risk there is not simply that economic growth might be affected or that innovation might be limited. There is a risk that technologies are developed that become simply essential to modern life, and that we cannot live without them, and that as a country we become a technology taker, that we effectively find ourselves losing the ability to manage our own communities and societies effectively. And to give you a sense of the reality of this, you could describe what has happened to media over the last 25 years in exactly those terms. 25 years ago, media happened primarily through well understood technologies, and countries had regulators that applied whatever their particular social values were to the way that information spread around society and the way that irresponsible use of media was controlled. Today, perhaps one of the most, if not the most powerful form of media distribution in all of our countries is managed by AI-driven robotic systems controlled largely from California. That has been, one way of looking at that is a huge loss of sovereignty, a huge loss of the ability of societies to manage the world in which they live. And so when we talk about getting the regulation right and the need to both balance innovation and safety, the innovation side of it is not simply about economic value and economic gain. It is also about whether, as societies and countries, we have the know-how, the skill, the technology to actually manage our societies. One of the things we have been wrestling with social media is it's fine to say, you know, we don't want social media to result in extremism, or we don't want social media to manipulate people. But do we have the tools to understand this, to be able to regulate those things in a sensible way? And that comes down to the technical capabilities of each of our countries. So I hope those thoughts give you a sense of some of the issues that are informing UK thinking, which maybe put a slightly different emphasis on the correct regulatory approach compared to the recent proposals in Europe. Although, just to say, I mean, I think it is wonderful that so many people are thinking deeply about these problems and coming up with, you know, very intelligent thoughts about how they can be addressed. And it is really important that this debate continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. Very dense points you made there. I think you gave me a lot of inspiration for follow-up questions to you, but also to Lucilla. You've been warned for round two. Lubna, I said I'd go to you. Lubna is CEO and founder of Opera Technologies, and she's also a member of the European Commission's expert group on artificial intelligence that's been working in the run-up to this proposal for the past few years. Now, Lubna, it's hard to tell because you look as young as I do, but you've been working for over 15 years in artificial intelligence, and particularly in the past few years with your company, you're really focused on the many areas of healthcare and application of AI in healthcare, some of which Laetitia described very well in her intervention, also describing the impact in terms of helping us resolve the workforce issues and scarcity that we have in healthcare, among other things. In your experience, what is the biggest challenge that we face in actually implementing good AI solutions in healthcare? Is it because there's not enough trust from patients and doctors that there's no good rules that we can use and therefore it's all uncertain? Or is it because it's virtually impossible to comply with the Gdpr and figure out how to use data in healthcare? Any other reason you can mention? What is it?
First of all, thank you for having me here. And also I congratulate the European Commission on publishing the awaited proposal on the new regulation on AI and emphasize the merits and the areas of improvements that we can think of. Let's not forget the EU remains the first region in the world to come up with this comprehensive regulation, especially with focus on human rights. So that's great milestone. And to answer your question, what is really the important challenge that we need to solve, especially in healthcare? I would say data is number one. As an engineer, and an entrepreneur doing the work and the hands-on work with artificial intelligence. From my perspective, AI is not located somewhere in a vague future that has to be firstly perfectly designed, whether it's with regulations or toolings, then implemented very carefully. No, for me, it's already here, and it's actual real-time work that we need to address at Okra with our existing clients already every day, which means that in order to optimize our results, we need to provide the machine with data and to refresh that data and keep optimizing that. So that's the raw material. Without it, all the benefits people anticipate for the promotion of their healthcare will not happen. So while I understand the risk that comes with that, for example, re-identification of patients due to the sensitive and personal nature of health data, or when it comes to the AI system, like around the bias of the AI systems, and other risks of hampering innovation, there are other risks that can stop our innovation in AI as well if we don't have access to this raw material. So it is not the first complex challenge that we faced in medicine. It's always been the case that we need to balance. It's a balancing exercise that we have to do, whether we're developing new treatments, new vaccines, or new technology. It's an exercise to mitigate the harm to the extent possible, at the same time amplify the opportunity and the benefits for people. So safety first cannot lead to paralysis and loss of opportunity to save lives today until we come up with the perfect regulatory framework. So that's we all understood, and we were very close now with this pandemic to leave that mitigation with the vaccine as an example. So if you look to machine learning and AI, it requires data in order to advance, in order to optimize, and in order to fulfill its potential to save lives in healthcare. So to me, there is really good ground for optimism that we will manage to future-proof our data. Anonymization techniques in Europe. We have the initiative that's around European health data space. It's been discussed a lot, but also the awareness that's been created. So in order for this to happen, close cooperation between the stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, between the member states, is necessary across Europe in order to create a clear framework for how we anonymize data, how we share data, how we ensure that all countries advance with the same pace towards building regulations that will enable to secure gathering of data for AI healthcare solution. So it is very important to understand that AI advances, our data anonymization techniques will have to be revisited and agreed, constantly re-evaluated and adapted. Our frameworks have to be flexible to allow for the development of AI. So AI itself will provide some of the solutions to the bigger problem, and will enable our healthcare system to move to better outcomes, to individualized outcomes, but also to be more cost effective. But without data, we cannot get there faster. So in the future, I would urge the industry and the stakeholders, regulators, payers, healthcare providers, and as well as life sciences and private sector to discuss what the barriers are and how we can cultivate trust in this ecosystem, because the goal is one and the patient is always in the center, and that's not let's not forget about that. And that's exactly what we at Okra focus on, because we develop systems that use data to bridge the communication between the stakeholders in the healthcare ecosystem, between life sciences and doctors, between payers and drug manufacturers. So how can we create that trust with AI? How can we continuously create the evidence? And also move faster to an AI-empowered healthcare system. And as society, we have to accept some low risk of AI that can never be completely eliminated, because there will always be, we need to continuously check the systems, of course, but there is always a risk. It can never be 100% accurate. They are mostly driven by probability. So in the same way that we accept the possibility of potential side effects, for example, of treatments in every medical process, in every surgery that it happens, we can do the same here.
Thank you so much, Lubna. Indeed, healthcare is one of the areas where it is quite evident that the potential is huge by using AI, and there's also a lot of challenges that we're here to address and solve, hopefully. So thank you for that. Next up, and before I go to the next speaker, I should probably remind our audience that you can actually ask our panel questions in the Q&A function on the event platform. And in the latter part of our panel, we will ask questions from the audience. Next up, I have Jan Kleijsen, who is Director for Information Society and Action Against Crime at the Council of Europe. He has a long-standing career in the Council of Europe and has held many important high-ranking positions since 1983 there. Clearly, international institutions are key to creating consensus around rules for AI, clearly to address the fundamental rights aspects and make sure that those are protected across geographies, irrespective of where people are, but also, quite frankly, for business, because having rules that companies can find uniformly across the geographies where they operate tends to be a good thing for companies that operate across borders. In 2019, the Council of Europe set up an ad hoc committee on AI, precisely to look at all the various facets around AI. Can you describe its tasks and what it's currently doing?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Good afternoon to you all from Strasbourg. Perhaps before setting out what CAHAI is doing, a few words about the Council of Europe. As you can see behind me, we have existed for over 70 years. And as you can also see behind me, we are in fact, although a regional organization, set standards that apply worldwide, especially in the field of technology. At the opening of this seminar, you mentioned the Gdpr as an example of worldwide regulation of a particular issue. It is perhaps interesting to note that the Gdpr itself was based and is based on the Council of Europe's Data Protection Convention, which celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. It was the first instrument on data protection and has now been ratified by 55 countries worldwide who sit at the table as equal partners. The Council of Europe 20 years ago established the first international treaty on cybercrime, which today has been ratified by 65 countries worldwide. And last year, we were active in more than 120 countries with capacity building projects. So just to indicate that the Council of Europe, with its currently 47 member states, has been setting standards relating to new technologies based on human rights, rule of law, and democracy, which are the three purposes for which our organization was created, that became standards well beyond the geographical area of the Council of Europe. So against this background and with this tradition, it is not surprising that our member states decided also to explore the possibilities of setting international legal standards on, and not on indeed, as Roger said, on artificial intelligence as such, but on the design and application of artificial intelligence in those fields where its use directly affects human rights, rule of law, and democracy. And we live in times, and the pandemic has clearly shown this also, where, of course, digitalization is rapidly increasing, and governments are, to come to the theme of today, increasingly also delegating to artificial intelligence applications, functions that were normally carried out before by human beings, by civil servants, if you like, or by others. And that ranges from court functions, decisions taken by courts, such as parole, arbitration, sentencing even. There are pilot projects on sentencing, to federal job agencies, to policing, think about facial recognition, to careers in the civil service, to tax matters, to family allowances paid by governments, and the list is endless. Because governments are delegating more and more to artificial intelligence, of course, issues arise in addition to the obvious benefits that many of these applications have, to the risks they pose. And that is very much the core theme of the work of the CAI, the committee you mentioned. It is composed, first of all, of the representative of 47 Council of Europe member states, but also importantly, 6 observer states, that is to say the 5 permanent observers of the Council of Europe, which are the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and the Holy See, and Israel, which has specifically requested to be admitted as an observer to the work of CAI. So already from the beginning, we're sitting with 53 states around the table, so almost the double of the European Union, if you like. And of course, all the 27 European Union states are also around the table. In addition, we have 25 companies, and I think it's important to set the stage as regards who is at the table. 25 companies, which include Apple, Google, Microsoft, AT&T, British Telecom, IEEE, Kaspersky, around the table, as well as a number of telecoms and associations of smaller European service providers. And we have civil society active in this particular area, such as Algorithm Watch or Access Now, all being there. And in addition, we have academia. So we're sitting in CAI with some 130 people looking at what? We've been given the mandate to examine the possibilities. We were given the mandate in 2019, as you said, to examine necessary to establish a legal framework for the design and use of artificial intelligence. And the CAI, in its first years of operation, although hampered by the pandemic, examined existing legal frameworks, had a look what is out there, what already exists and what does apply to AI. National legislation, international legislation. And the conclusion of this was published in December in what we call the feasibility study, which came to the conclusion that although the use of AI is already regulated by a series of international treaties and also national legislations, important gaps remained. Important gaps remain because the legislation and treaties that do apply, for instance, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Data Protection Convention I just mentioned, Cybercrime Convention, several others, but none of them were specifically written for artificial intelligence, and there are therefore gaps. And the conclusion was that these gaps should be filled, and they should be filled through a mix of binding law, i.e. a convention, and a series of non-binding rules and recommendations, guidelines, if you like, that could apply. And like the European Commission, also the approach taken by the CAI is one of the high-risk areas where, of course, the binding elements, the binding rules are more important. And I would take this opportunity to react for a moment also here to what Roger Taylor said earlier on, that this sort of regulation, that it's perhaps seen in terms by some as a choice between safety and innovation. We very much have a different experience, I must say, in CAI. It is the companies that I just mentioned that push very much for common legal standards, because what we hope to achieve is a set of internationally binding rules for governments, and if they're not binding, at least internationally agreed rules for lower risk areas, which would provide legal certainty for companies. It would provide legal certainty for companies. It would provide legal certainty for customers. It would provide a level playing ground, because the alternative would be a patchwork of different national rules and regulations, probably with a Swiss cheese effect, namely there would be loopholes and gaps that would make it very difficult, or more difficult in any case, for companies to develop their products, and also to know what their liability, what the risks were, what the conditions were. And of course, it would make it much more difficult for the citizens to know what is really trustworthy AI. So at the moment, we are our governments accepted the results of this feasibility study, and the KAI is at the moment collecting the elements that could go on the one hand in the treaty, and on the other hand in a set of regulations. And the proposals that the European Commission made, of course, will be taken. The European Commission, of course, I should add, also has a seat at our table, as has UNESCO, the OECD. So whatever is happening in other international organizations will be taken on board. But the specificity, I think, of the work of the Council of Europe is the rights-based approach. It is to ensure that citizens will know what their rights are, that governments will protect these rights, which will also include remedies, of course, and guarantees that the use of AI meets the requirements of human rights, rule of law, and democracy. Perhaps I'll leave it, and perhaps the last but not least, we have launched a public consultation. You still have time to react until the 29th of April. The public consultation is open. You'll find it on the Council of Europe website, or just if you Google or whatever, use whatever search engine for the Council of Europe, public consultation AI, you find a questionnaire, and we're very happy to receive your comments on the proposals that are currently on the table. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Indeed, very important work from the Council of Europe, and clearly will be. I think everybody's very interested to see where that will lead us. Next up, I have Paolo Benanti, who's extraordinary professor at the Faculty of Theology at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. You clearly work on moral theology, on bioethics and neuroethics. And these are all topics that are central in discussions about AI, including about the rules for AI. There doesn't seem to be a discussion about AI that's not about ethics. Are we sort of overdoing that discussion? Isn't it true that particularly when we talk about laws, there are always in the background ethical choices that we make by writing rules into laws? So what is it that's different now about AI in this discussion?
Salve, grazie per questo invito anche da parte mia. Quello che mi sembra di poter dire è che
I seem to be understanding, and I want to be saying, is that when we talk about these technologies, which indeed are both a continuity and a discontinuity from the past, is, as it happens with any technology, we need a principle of precaution. Ever since man was able to enhance his own power through technologies, we need to control what we can or cannot do. But in the case of artificial intelligence, we have a level to comply with. And the level is this. In designing a system of artificial intelligence, you overcome the standard designing pattern we were used previously, when the operator would define if this, then that, that is, all circumstances a machine would be confronted with. And in the light of those circumstances, a decision was taken on an a priori basis on the answer of the machine. What's novel about the introduction of the artificial intelligence is that whatever has to do with machine learning, data, and human interaction into models which have, to a certain extent, some degrees of freedom, complicates our action. Ethics goes back to the center, where the certainty of the result cannot be forecasted on an a priori basis. So what about the major ethical directives and guidelines that are being put at stake following this innovation. If we enforce and apply artificial intelligence in all our actions, and we acknowledge that what AI is not a special purpose technology helping us to do better some kind of task, but it's a general purpose technology that is the ability of changing whatever we do independently of what we're doing. So then we have to acknowledge that the new layer created within the framework of the action of each single human being between ourselves and our will, where this layer in the hands of AI may produce a disgregation of personal liability. And we'll think about an autonomous car and how this indeed change the idea of liability of its owner or the pilot, the driver of this particular car. Now, in the light of all this, certainly ethical guidelines as well as the ethical background must be able to clarify on an a priori basis and with a great deal of determination how and when personal liability is defined. The second issue is transparency in terms of actions, because whatever has to do with algorithms and data through different intermediations runs the risk of being put into a number of black boxes which seldom are accessible to everyone whilst the production is taking place. Well, a programmer knows very well how it is difficult today to write a code from scratch to the end. You include libraries developed by third parties, and this inclusion of data, libraries, or pieces of code by other people create a level of complexity which, given the ability of surrogating the decision power by humans, requires to become transparent and understandable before actually getting into a social level. And then there is another level of ethical complexity. Therefore, we have to pay a greater attention in ethical terms to this stage of technological innovation. And it resides on the ability by AI to form structures, that is, to really shape our own organized life. But how can we talk about all this? I'd like to introduce two typical examples coming from technological ethics. When in New York City in the 40s, they built up concrete bridges connecting Manhattan to Long Island. They were indeed built a couple of feet under the standard. Why? Because we know that those who were in control of that particular process thought that access to Long Island should be guaranteed only to the white middle class, whilst ethnical minorities did not own a car at that time. So each single technology artifact is a way of exercising power within society. This is no longer a concrete bridge or whatever, from banks to insurance companies to access to schools to medicine, etc. They indeed introduce or deny rights that are not written into the code but are part of our constitution. Between the right which is wanted and guaranteed in a democratic system requires an enforcement which is finer than just social ethics. And the last element when it comes to talk about the human gender and its relationship with algorithms has to do with the size of the platform. Whenever a human action is based on a platform, the platform teaches us that we are allowed to have access to something at a very low cost, but in exchange you have a middle layer between the political dimension and execution, which is in the hands of the platform controllers. So at social level, algorithmic structuring through artificial intelligence creates new social actors who need to be controlled from the ethical standpoint and then regulated, as we have just heard, from a principle of hard law without a soft law, but a hard law without soft law loses a little bit of its power. But when it comes to democracy and people's rights, we need the ethics may accompany all processes, not just giving solutions, but raising question on humankind, its value, and how to protect all this.
Thanks a lot, Paolo. Thank you. With this, I think we have an excellent segue to go back to the panelists for a second round, if we have time. And I promised I would go back to Lucilla, sparked largely by what Roger was saying. And I think he highlighted, ultimately, if I can sum it up this way, a difference between thinking about regulating AI horizontally versus vertically in the different fields of application. And this is probably, probably has to do with the risk-based approach that we've been discussing for a long time, and that appears to be reflected in one way or another in the Commission's approach, which is clearly the idea that you should be regulating based on the actual risks that the systems present, and therefore you should be adopting rules that are adapted to that risk. And the way that the Commission seems to have done it in the proposal is to go through a conformity assessment approach, as you described, which I think most people are familiar with as the CE mark. That's a very interesting approach because the CE mark was born to deal with testing and demonstrating compliance with physical characteristics of physical products. For example, testing the electromagnetic limits of an appliance, for example, to which you have a test that's very easy to measure and you have a result that's a clear yes or no. Now, AI seems to be somewhat different from that, and it's also a system that tends to be pretty burdensome administratively and also costly for companies to comply with product testing and CE conformance. So how would you say that this proposal still reflects a risk-based approach and is proportionate, and on the other hand, on the other end of that equation, we have sufficient room for innovation, as well as the other things that Roger discussed, sovereignty, whatever you want to call it precisely. But how do you find that balance based on this approach?
Okay, first, thanks a lot for giving me this time to reply. Let me say that there is a big misunderstanding here. We are not creating a regulator for artificial intelligence. So this has to be very clear because I think it has been pointed out, and I want to make very clear that this is not the case. In fact, as you say, what we are putting in place is a system of CE marking. With this system, the operators of artificial intelligence only for the use cases indicated in the list. So in the case of specific artificial intelligence being put or being part of a use case which basically places the artificial intelligence in a certain context. So we are looking at artificial intelligence, for example, in recruitment, artificial intelligence used for certain education applications, or artificial intelligence used to establish the creditworthiness of a person. In these cases, we apply, like we apply for the case of artificial intelligence, for example, in a medical device, we apply the same product market registration we have in the European Union based on CE marking. The operators will have to get a CE marking before they put the service in the market or before they use the service in the market. And what they do is that they will have to comply with the 5 requirements explained earlier, which include documentation, which include information to the user, making sure that the systems are accurate and performant. And then, of course, they will be minimizing the risk that harm occurs. As Lubna said earlier, we will never be able to completely eliminate the risk. We can only minimize it. But if harm takes place, Then there is a market surveillance authority, which is normally, it will be appointed by the member states. It's not appointed by the European Commission, but it's normally probably the regulator or the minister in charge of the different sectors. And they will have the task to go and check what has been assessed before it was put on the market. And this may lead to maybe withdraw the service from the market or to have a sanction if really there was a fault in the assessment before it was placed on the market. So this system has worked very well for product market registration, also because it opens the way to work with standards. And in fact, I mean, this was also the importance of standards was already highlighted by the Council of Europe. We really hope that this approach will give rise to an interest by operators and industry to get together and develop standards that by nature have to be international standards. So we think that this system is not particularly burdensome and that we give legal certainty exactly because we identify the use cases. We don't leave it up to the companies to understand if they're putting in place a risky artificial intelligence system and then decides whether they have to undertake a conformity assessment or not. This is very clear in the legislation, so we think we give legal certainty. And in these cases, we hope, of course, also that there will be greater use of artificial intelligence because nowadays in Europe, more than half of the companies tell us they don't use AI because they don't trust it. So when we published this regulatory package, we also published another document that people unfortunately never talk about, which is the coordinated plan with member states, a list of measures that support the development of AI. And with the regulatory framework, we want to make sure that AI in Europe is trustworthy so that people, business, organizations use it more than they actually do today. And we can really harness the benefits of this technology in the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think with this, I'll go back briefly to Roger again. There seems to be a ping pong of questions and answers stimulated by your very interesting interventions. So I'm going to give you like a hypothetical scenario. And you sort of answered this already, but maybe this question will allow you to elaborate further. So imagine you can have a binary choice between a regulation that, sort of like the CE marking approach, sets very stringent rules and processes to show that you're compliant with certain rules. And on the other hand, you have the option of a regulation that's still horizontal, so probably not what you would want at this point in time, but still horizontal, but it limits itself to saying that certain identified use cases that we think are negative as a society are forbidden, and then it leaves it to the deployers of the AI system to figure out how to do that. Which one should we choose?
I think the starting point would be to resist strongly any attempt to suggest that regulation can be split up into these different techniques. I think in almost every situation, good regulation involves an understanding of processes and having regulatory processes. It involves having certain things that are banned, and it involves ongoing monitoring of the outcomes and the consequences of regulation and the degree to which the harms are being managed. And in some parts of life, you can lean more on the process side. That is particularly true when we have a very full and complete understanding of the harms we are concerned about and how to measure them. So, for example, in medical regulation, we focus a lot on the process of trialing drugs as a mechanism for safety. However, it is very plain to everyone that we also need to have effective mechanisms for monitoring what happens in the real world afterwards, because there are with every process, however well you design it, there's a way of getting through and still doing the bad thing. So you need to have outcomes as well. And of course, the more that the situation is novel and less clearly understood, the greater the value of understanding outcomes. And again, I'm going to illustrate that with the social media example to simply say that if somebody had said an automated recommendation system for videos, does that sound high risk? I think people would say, no, it is not high risk. And now we are worried that it may be undermining democracy. So we need to look at both outcomes. Thank you.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I seem to have lost the audio here in the studio. So I missed the last part of your answer, which is very unfortunate for me, but I'm sure that the rest of the audience will have grabbed that. So, so bad for me. I want to go to Antonio, I think, after this exchange. I think there's also the user aspect that we haven't really tackled so far, because quite clearly protection also starts with more skilled users who know what the technology is about. And if you know what the technology is about, you know how to use it, you're less afraid of it, you're not fooled by the technology. So what do you think is the role of users, and maybe also the responsibility of users in understanding and engaging AI systems?
Yes, this is correct. Samsung work on a worldwide basis in different geographic areas. We collaborate with entities, governments, and we only distribute products that have overcome this problem. And let me tell that this is a company which is actually changing the way they change their products. Safety and security was considered to be something that had to do with final users. Since some years now, the approach is secure by design. Security is a prerequisite in the development stage of our product, so that the product eventually is intrinsically safe and secure. Let me tell you that this is just one side of this medal. As you were rightly pointing out, there is a way products, technologies, and services are being used. Well, clearly, the general approach is that we have, as general users, the fact that we can bring into the digital world the same common sense that we had in the physical one. And large companies, from this particular point of view, have the liability not only to have safe products and keep them safe over time, but they can work on their clients so that this awareness, that is the need of having virtuous behavior when we come into contact with technologies and digital services, is being understood completely and is being indeed empowered. So we carry out campaigns so that common sense may prevail, and you adopt a good enough approach vis-à-vis technologies which we have learned to use and to develop safely. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Just to reassure everybody, it was just the batteries on my earphone that died, but now I can hear you, so that's great. Perhaps I can go back to Jan now. I mean, you mentioned the work that's going on with the ad hoc committee, and there's a consultation that you reminded everybody about the possibility of responding to. And clearly, I mean, there's a level of, we heard from everybody virtually, there's a level of recognition that we need rules. There seems to be still a level of variance as to what those rules exactly look like. So given the remit and the broad spectrum of countries that are involved in this effort, I know you can't commit to anything, but as far as you can tell right now, what do you think you can already tell could be included possibly in those rules?
Yes, thank you very much. Well, as I mentioned, and you recalled kindly, we still have, of course, also the public consultation going on, so we look very much forward to also your ideas. But the study I mentioned that was adopted in December already indicates a few ways forward at the horizontal level. And that is what the CAI committee is working on. We're also working on the vertical level. I'll say one or two sentences about that later. But what CAI is working on is that there should be some core principles which are based, incidentally, on the fact that AI doesn't have any responsibility. It's humans. that have responsibility. I think that's also sometimes mentioned in debates, the processes itself or the machinery, but it's of course the humans that are responsible. And in our case, very much also governments. So what are some of the rights? It's transparency. Citizens have a right to know, should have the right to know when they're dealing with AI. You're probably aware that in California, a law already obliges companies of a certain size to inform their customers if they're interacting with bots instead of with human beings. And a similar rule, I think, is very much needed also as regards the citizens in dealing with the government. Awareness, making people aware how to engage with artificial intelligence, to do a human rights impact assessment before rolling out, for instance, the use of artificial intelligence in prisons. There are all sorts of projects existing, and it so happens I deal with prison matters in the Council of Europe. In Singapore, there is a fully autonomous prison which doesn't have prison guards. The care of prisoners is done by robots and automated systems. Now, I do not think that is the way we would like to go. And that already, of course, raises a number of issues on the impact assessment of when you roll out artificial intelligence. Facial recognition, of course, is not another one. Then human in control. The fact that I mentioned before the human-centric approach, but also the fact that there should always be a possibility of human override. The final decision should be taken by a competent, I stress also competent human being who knows what is happening, the system, and can intervene if necessary. Certification was also mentioned in the context of the European Commission's proposal. It is also being discussed in CAI because much is being said about the European Medicine Agency these days, EMA, with regard to vaccination. The Council of Europe is host to the European Pharmacopoeia and therefore also involved in certification of medicine. And there are perhaps some examples that could be used for that. Qualification of those that develop the AI systems. Just let me give you an example. If AI were to be used in the judiciary to replace certain functions currently held, for instance, by judges, democratic countries set very high standards for the qualification of a judge, for the appointment of a person as a judge. So if the tasks of a judge are to be taken over by an automated system, one can, I think, reasonably put the question that those who develop that system should also have particular qualifications, and that those should also be checked. So these are some of the rights that, and of course, the AI applications should be non-discriminatory, should respect human dignity and general human rights, such as set out in the European Convention on Human Rights. And just one sentence on also the vertical approach. So on the one hand, it is rules that would apply to any use of AI and also be technologically neutral. Because, for instance, human advancement of new technology would apply to everything that is currently in existence, but it would also apply to the products that perhaps some bright kid in a garage is inventing at this very moment, and that will become indispensable to our lives. So also with regard to future technological developments. And then on the vertical approach, in addition to these horizontal standards, we're working on specific standards, again, in a similar composition as CAI, on issues such as data protection, racism, criminal law and autonomous vehicles, for instance, freedom of expression, bioethics, very important issue, and the judicial system, just to give you some examples. As you rightly mentioned, I can't give you all the provisions yet that will be retained. They are being discussed by the stakeholders I mentioned, and indeed also by the wider community to whom we have reached out with our questionnaire. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jan. We have 2 minutes to go. I have one last question for which it's probably more complex than I would like to answer. But there's this concept, I think, of transparent AI that is somehow opposed to opaque AI, and this variant of AI makes sure that the algorithms are trained in a way that in the end, whatever get as a result, in the end, we already know the result because we've set the result. It can only be one of the results that we want the AI system to reach. So can this be the version of AI that responds to all the challenges that we have been exploring related to AI systems? Or maybe that's not the version of AI that we think about, because if AI can only give you answers that you already know, is that really AI? Who wants to take this? I would sort of ping like either Leticia or Lubna, because I think this is particularly important for healthcare. But whoever wants to take the last question as the last word. Who wants to go?
Yeah, I happy. So if we say about transparency, it's very crucial in healthcare, as you know, and it's not about transparency of only about the transparency of the methodology, but it's mostly around how the AI algorithm got to the prediction or the outcome, and it's mostly to do around the explainability as well, like what is the reasons behind that prediction. And it is from a technical perspective, it is almost an art to bring correlation and causality together. Most of the machine learning techniques use correlation driven distance metrics to come to the answer. So if we want to know the reasons and to be transparent around how it comes to those, so almost we need to run another AI on top of it to derive the causality and to find out what is all the causality relationships between the data we have, which is for some industries like healthcare very important, but for others is not, because if you are on an algorithm on network optimization, that's explainability and transparency are less of importance than when it comes to evidence-based industries such as healthcare, education, and others. So maybe that's my contribution.
Thank you so much, Lubna. I'm afraid that's all we have for. I think we could go on for at least another half an hour or an hour and a half. But that's all we have time for. I think it was very interesting as a discussion. I hope it was as stimulating to the audience as it was to me. And I think this is a very nice introduction to the legislative discussions that we'll have as soon as I go back to my day job in Brussels on the proposal for a regulation. And all the aspects that we've discussed will surely be debated for a number of months and possibly years, as we've seen with the GDPR. With this proposal. And we hope to see you all to check on how we're doing and on AI and digital topics next year. Thank you all very much.